acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional owners of this land in which we gather, pay my respects to elders past, present, and recognise that in our industry we have a unique opportunity to incorporate the knowledge and talent and wisdom of the First Nations people into the developments and the built environment. We are champions of industry and government. We're city shapers, community creators, and we're Lend-Lease colleagues. So I welcome you all here, and it's a pleasure to officially welcome the Minister also. Today we are in Barangaroo, and we're very, very delighted to have you here to host you in this beautiful development. Barangaroo is an integral part of Sydney's dynamic economic and cultural social fabric. The neighbourhood and precinct is a showcase of international design, excellence in construction and leading technologies and sustainability, outstanding dining and retail and health and wellbeing, and public art and cultural programs, and we're very proud of this development. Simply, it is a shining example of what Lend-Lease can create and will continue to create well into the future under a new revitalised strategy. Barangaroo, though, does not incorporate all that we do. Lend-Lease is also committed to pipeline of defence infrastructure and a defence force in a strategically significant way. Defence is actually our construction business's largest client, and currently we have $3.5 billion worth of work in construction, $5 billion worth of work in planning, and we've probably delivered about $5 billion worth of work historically in the last 10 years. So, Minister, you're a very important client for us, and we're obviously very grateful to have you here. The work that we've done actually spans the whole of Australia. We have work in HMA Stirling in WA, work in Osborne down in South Australia, we're up in Northern Territory at Tyndall, and we have lots of projects across the east coast of Australia. So we're very proud of that work, and we work very, very closely with the Defence and the federal government. I look forward to hearing what you have to say today, and we understand that getting work out the door and delivered can be a struggle, particularly in the current climate of procurement processes. But we really appreciate the work that we can deliver for you, and we look forward to assisting the federal government and defence over the next few years. So thank you, and I'll pass on to Ed, who will be your MC for the day. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Tony, and can I thank Lend-Lease for hosting us here today. We're incredibly grateful for the hospitality, and it's fantastic to see so many new faces as well here at this McKell Institute event this afternoon. Can I begin too by acknowledging we're meeting here on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present. Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Ed Kavanagh. I'm the CEO of the McKell Institute. The McKell Institute is a public policy think tank that works closely with trade unions, civil society, business and government to advance practical policy ideas and to create forums just like this one where those ideas can be explained and interrogated. I want to thank everyone being here today. I want to note the diversity of stakeholders we have in the room. We have folks from the international development sector, from industry, civil society, across the corporate sector and others. Now, shortly we'll hear from the Minister and then commence a moderated Q&A, but I just wanted to provide a little bit of context first for this conversation. Now, for regular McKell Institute attendees here today, you might be wondering, why is a domestic policy think tank hosting a conversation about policy beyond our shores? And our view at the organisation is simply this: Australia can be shaped by an increasingly dynamic global environment, or it can work to shape it. And our policy conversations at home are inextricably linked to a secure and stable world that Australia has a responsibility to try and bend to its interests. But while we believe certainly in an ambitious global Australia, we also recognise that Australia's influence in much of the world is at times checked by its size and its geography. Across the Pacific, however, Australia is uniquely consequential. Now, I'm one of the many Australians in this room who's been lucky enough to travel all across the Pacific Islands, particularly Solomon Islands, over the last few years. And I can tell you, travelling and working in the region shapes you, but it also informs you of the depths of the challenges that our neighbours confront and the outsized impact that Australian public policy can have when we get things right, but also when we get things wrong. Good Australian Pacific policy can be truly transformational. It can change the lives of Pacific Islanders and Australians. It can strengthen Pacific resilience and sovereignty and enhance Australia's international standing and security in the process. But poor policy can undermine Pacific agency, and it can weaken Australia's international standing and security, and I think at times frustrate a region that has in the past been viewed by some cynically as a place filled with problems and not partners. Now, fortunately, Australia's Pacific engagement and policy architecture is, I think, improving markedly. Now, when Minister Conroy was appointed Minister for the Pacific and International Development in May of 2022, he certainly faced a daunting task. As was well covered in the media, the geopolitics had become more complex and precarious, but so too had a whole bunch of other challenges. The post-pandemic economic and development challenges were more complex. The relationships had become complex and precarious. The future of countless Pacific communities were becoming more perilous, being exposed as they are to a worsening climate. So in this context, the government has certainly placed the Pacific at the centre of its foreign policy and placed development policy, as the Minister noted in his deacon oration last year, to the heart of Australian statecraft. Now, there's a lot to show for it already, which I'm sure the Minister will get into. But I think in leading these efforts, Minister Conroy has demonstrated a clear determination to understand the region genuinely, respect the region, and in doing so, elevated the Pacific portfolio to such a degree that it is now in Cabinet. So folks, to elaborate further on this record of achievement and what's next for Australia's Pacific strategy, please join me in welcoming the Minister of International Development and Pacific, Pat Conroy.
Well, thank you very much, and I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Thank you to Ed and the McKell Institute for inviting me to give this address on the Albanese Government's Pacific agenda. McKell is one of Australia's most dynamic think tanks, and I congratulate you for the quality of your research program. It makes an important contribution to the policy debate in this country. To Tony and his team, thank you for hosting us here in this beautiful building. I am incredibly jealous that you get to go to work every day in this magnificent spectre of the Pacific Ocean. And yes, it's the Sydney Harbour, but it is the Pacific Ocean, and I'll be reflecting on that in my speech. Ask our friends overseas what springs to mind when they think of Australia, and there will be plenty who immediately focus on our land and think of images of the rugged outback. Endless plains of rusty red, sparsely peppered with low shrubs, maybe a mob of kangaroos hopping off into the distance. It's an image immortalised through words like Dorothy McKellar's "The Wide Brown Land for Me." But my focus today is on what surrounds our wide brown land. The Pacific Ocean connects us to our nearest neighbours. It's the world's largest ocean. So large that countries across the region now refer to it as the Blue Pacific continent. This Blue Pacific was a central part of Labor's foreign policy commitment at the last election. And in government, we have been working very hard to implement our vision for stronger engagement with the Pacific. And today I'd like to take you through the Albanese Government's Pacific engagement and demonstrate how it reflects Labor's history of working with the region. And I'd like to make the case that under the Albanese Government, Pacific engagement, under the Albanese Government, there has been a truly transformational change in Australia's approach to the Pacific. But also I think there's a case to be made for all of us, all Australians, to pay a lot more attention to the Blue Pacific continent at our shores. Now, ladies and gentlemen, next year will be 10 years since Peter Dutton was caught on a hot mic joking about the Pacific, saying that, and I quote, "Time doesn't mean anything when you're about to have water lapping at your door." 10 years since that happened. It feels a bit like Groundhog Day when we now have Mr. Dutton talking about ditching Paris targets and a cavalier attitude to climate change, which is being thrown around yet again. This core aversion to acknowledging that climate change is real, that it poses an imminent threat to the Pacific, drastically undermined the former government's Pacific relationships. The Coalition described its Pacific Step Up as one of Australia's highest foreign policy priorities. But no matter what measures were put in place, the last government's inability to accept climate change as a central pillar of how the Pacific saw its own security fundamentally unstuck their policy. Labor knew we had to carve a different path. and I was incredibly proud to take a comprehensive package of Pacific policies to the last election. It was the first time an Australian party had elevated the importance of the Pacific in its election commitments to that extent, to the extent that it dominated our election narrative for at least 2 days of the campaign cycle. Central to that policy was the ALP's focus on climate change, not just in relation to the Pacific, but across the board. Pacific leaders have declared that climate change is the number one threat to the security of their people, and they are right. And take a moment to consider the arrogance of not listening to them on this existential threat. There is so much wrong with Peter Dutton's regressive and reactionary approach to climate change. But one aspect that has not received sufficient attention is the enormous damage it would do to Australia's Pacific relationships. These are important relationships that the Albanese government has been working tirelessly to improve since the 2022 election. Just 4 days into her new role as Foreign Minister, Penny Wong travelled to Fiji to set out this new direction and committed to real action on climate change. In a speech at the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, she said that for too long, Australia had been ignoring Pacific voices urging us to act on climate change. This acknowledgement helped unlock a new era of engagement, trust, and mutual respect. Since that time, we've brought energy, focus, and strategic coordination to Australia's Pacific relationships. This extends across the Cabinet room, from the Prime Minister to the Deputy Prime Minister, the Treasurer, Attorney General, Minister for Home Affairs, and so many other colleagues. A great example of this is our commitment to our relationship with Papua New Guinea. Earlier this year, PNG's Prime Minister Marape became the first Pacific leader to address a joint sitting of the Australian Parliament. This followed Prime Minister Albanese becoming the first foreign leader to address PNG's Parliament in 2023. We then had both Prime Ministers walking the Kokoda track together. That track, that fabled dirt path through the jungle, is lodged deep in our national consciousness as one of the ultimate symbols of sacrifice and mateship between Australia and our nearest neighbour. Prime Minister Marape and Albanese spent virtually every waking moment together for several days, including celebrating Prime Minister Marape's birthday. And in June, a very senior delegation, I would submit the most senior delegation ever, of 7 Australian ministers travelled to Port Moresby for the 30th PNG Australia Ministerial Forum. That level of ministerial engagement demonstrates this government's efforts to listen to the region. We are consistently listening to our Pacific neighbours, respecting them and responding to their priorities. Now, ladies and gentlemen, personal relationships are important, nay, vital in the Pacific. That's why the Foreign Minister and I have made it a priority to visit Pacific countries, to meet with Pacific leaders and communities. Penny Wong visited every member of the Pacific Islands Forum in her first year as Foreign Minister, and in just over 2 years has made 21 Pacific visits. By contrast, her predecessor Maurice Payne visited 6 Pacific Island countries in nearly 4 years as Foreign Minister. I've made 24 visits in my 2 years as Minister, compared to 35 visits by Pacific Minister predecessors during the 9.5 years of the foreign government. Let me repeat that, 24 in 2 years versus 35 in 9.5. We've been averaging 12 visits a year versus 3 visits a year to the Pacific in our time in government. And it's not just the number of visits, but the quality of the relationships that are created by repeated, respectful, and genuine engagement. For example, I've visited Papua New Guinea 7 times in 20 months, Vanuatu 4 times, and Fiji 3 times. This is not to mention the regular meetings Pacific leaders have in Australia. This renewed ministerial commitment has elevated the importance of the Pacific for Australian foreign policy. And there have been a huge number of significant achievements we can point to. New security and closer a relations pacts with PNG, Tuvalu and Fiji, increasing Australia's Pacific development assistance to a record $2 billion a year and working with our neighbours to deliver on their greatest needs. Increasing the number of Pacific workers in Australia under our labour mobility scheme, resulting in higher remittance flows to the region, along with skills gains and entrepreneurship. Creating the first ever Pacific permanent migration pathway through the Pacific Engagement Visa. Enhancing defence, policing and cyber cooperation across the region to help us collectively tackle security threats like cyber security, transnational crime and illegal fishing. Embedding a truly regional approach to security and putting the Pacific Islands Forum at the heart of how we manage our collective security. Driving sports diplomacy, a very favourite of mine, using a true Australian national asset combined with the inherent Pacific love of sports to grow our common bonds and influence, and building people-to-people links by supporting diaspora communities and faith networks. But I return to the central issue of climate change. Committing to real domestic action on climate change has ushered in a new level of Pacific trust and mutual respect, because action at home is critical to credibility abroad. This includes our commitment to reduce Australia's emissions by 43% by 2030 and to reach net zero emissions by 2050. Commitments now enshrined in legislation. Our strong domestic action has enabled us to put climate change at the centre of how we work with the Pacific. We've established a new Pacific Climate Infrastructure Financing Partnership, which is building climate-resilient infrastructure for Pacific communities. Infrastructure sturdy enough, for example, to withstand the next cyclone. We're investing in off-grid renewable energy generation projects for remote and rural communities in PNG, Vanuatu and Timor-Leste. We've made a foundational investment of $100 million in the Pacific Resilience Facility, which will deliver adaptation projects for the Pacific by the Pacific. We've supported Vanuatu's request to the International Court of Justice for an advisory opinion on climate change. We've supported the ongoing applicability of the law of the sea and the implications for statehood in the face of rising oceans. And critically and incredibly important symbolically, our landmark Whālepili Union Treaty with Tuvalu sets out the world's first treaty-level agreement on a pathway for mobility with dignity as climate impacts worsen. And in another world's first, in a legally binding agreement, the treaty recognises Tuvalu's statehood and sovereignty will continue, notwithstanding the impacts of climate-related sea level rise. Recognising many Tuvaluans want the choice to remain on the land of their ancestors, the treaty provides for enhanced climate adaptation and mobility with dignity, giving Tuvaluans the choice to stay or pursue new opportunities in Australia. This is truly the most significant agreement between Australia and a Pacific country since the agreements for PNG's independence in 1975. It will elevate the relationship between Australia and Tuvalu to a deep and comprehensive partnership, a true partnership between friends. And despite Green Senator David Shoebridge's doomsaying earlier this year, predicting that the agreement would unravel following Tuvalu's election, implementation of the treaty is progressing well in both countries. Our efforts on climate change have been received very well in the Pacific. While some people would like us to move faster, there is an understanding that the transition underway in Australia and the serious commitment of the Australian government. In conversation with Pacific counterparts, I find there is a much better appreciation of what the Albanese government is doing on climate change than on the part of some Australian commentators who prefer to tell the Pacific what to think rather than listen to the Pacific. The Albanese government's efforts build on a proud Australian Labor Party history of working with the Pacific. Take the great Gough Whitlam, whose portrait greets me every time I walk into my office in Parliament House. When Prime Minister Marape addressed our Parliament earlier this year, he said, and I quote, No greater legacy remains forever in the hearts and minds of Papua New Guinea than the imprint of Gough Whitlam's Labor government. The final cut of the umbilical cord between Australia and PNG took place under the watch of Prime Minister Whitlam and my forerunner, the father of my country, Great-Grand Chief Sir Michael Somare. He continued, "The name of Gough Whitlam will forever live on because of his leadership then. Papua New Guinea is independent today." End quote. That's a pretty significant foundation for Pacific engagement. Whitlam also appointed the first dedicated Pacific minister, Bill Morrison, to guide our relationship with PNG and shape our regional engagement. That Pacific ministerial position was abolished by Malcolm Fraser and not reinstated until the next Labor government. Paul Keating was struck by the challenge facing the Pacific when he visited Nauru as PM in 1993. He wrote later, and I quote, "I felt Australian policy needed to be more direct and honest. I also accepted that such an approach would require active engagement by Australia at the highest level." End quote. Keating followed that up by attending all meetings of the South Pacific Forum as Prime Minister, adopting new policies focused on Pacific economic growth and appointing Gordon Bilney as Minister for Pacific Island Affairs. That position was again abolished when John Howard came to power, and he had no dedicated Pacific minister between 1996 and 2007. Under the Rudd and Gillard governments, the position of Parliamentary Secretary for Pacific Affairs was held by Duncan Kerr, Richard Marles and Matt Thistlethwaite, and it's fair to say that in our current Deputy Prime Minister, we've got no greater enthusiast for our Pacific engagement, and he's a huge asset complementing Foreign Minister Penny Wong and Prime Minister Albanese. But Tony Abbott abolished the Parliamentary Secretary for the Pacific position in 2013. This pattern of Labor elevation and Liberal diminution was only broken by Malcolm Turnbull, who appointed a Minister for International Development and the Pacific. So while Pacific policy is more often than not bipartisan, Labor governments have taken the Pacific more seriously and have devoted more policy and political resources to the region. Prime Minister Albanese's recent changes to the ministry include having the Pacific Minister in Cabinet. This presents a huge opportunity to give a stronger voice to issues that are important to the Pacific family, of which Australia is a proud part. Labor has always understood the importance of the Pacific. In his first significant speech as Foreign Minister, Gareth Evans spoke about the region in ways which still resonate today. Evans said, and I quote, "We have clear geopolitical or strategic interests in preserving and promoting peace in the region, in promoting internal political stability and the peaceful evolution of democratic political systems in the island states, in keeping the region free from destabilising activity by any external power or group." Later he wrote, "Notwithstanding our greater size and economic capacity, we want to approach the region within a framework of regional partnership, not dominance, not regarding the South Pacific as our sphere of influence, but a region of mutually reinforcing opportunity." End quote. He emphasised the need to uphold the principles of sovereignty, regional cooperation and security through economic and social development. The concepts that Gareth Evans laid out more than 30 years ago remain highly relevant today, but the circumstances in which we are operating have changed dramatically. The strategic context we find ourselves in is multidimensional. The world is more connected than ever. Phones and access to data are ubiquitous, and Facebook is the most popular way of keeping in touch across the region. We have people travelling across borders more than ever. We also have significant economic connectivity and trade links which sit alongside our governmental and people-to-people links. With those growing connections, there are now more external partners showing greater interest in the Pacific than ever before. The Foreign Minister has spoken recently about how we are now in, and I quote, "in a state of permanent contest in the region," and how there is no rewind button to regain the ground that the former government lost. In that period of the last government, when the coalition abandoned the field, China was able to advance its national interests in ways that have, at times, differed from our interests and from others in the region. We want to see a region where states can exercise sovereignty free from coercion and in accordance with international law. We want a region that is peaceful and stable. So we need to work with the Pacific to ensure that it remains in the driver's seat, engaging with China and other partners on its terms to meet its ambition for a region that is peaceful, safe and prosperous. Now, of course, we recognise Australia's own success story would not be what it is today without China. So we'll always support partners in the region to explore economic growth opportunities. But we expect that that is not accompanied by coercion and interference. The Australian government takes an open approach in listening to our partners and delivering on their priorities, and we have called on China to do the same. China should be more transparent in the aid it is giving and should treat infrastructure projects as opportunities for the Pacific to grow local employment, skills and procurement. Infrastructure should be climate resilient, high quality and meet safeguards and inclusion benchmarks. The region has spelled out these priorities in the Pacific Quality Infrastructure Principles. That is what Pacific countries have asked for, and we encourage any country that wants to support the Pacific to use these principles as their starting point. The region has also spelled out in the 2022 Pacific Island Forum Leaders Communique that the security of the Pacific is the shared responsibility of the Pacific family. Australia is building on decades of law and order, law enforcement cooperation, investing to play our part in keeping and building peace in the region. We have pledged to the Boy Declaration on Regional Security and its expanded concept of security. And we are working with our Pacific partners to respond to natural disasters, maritime security demands, and new threats such as cyber. The recent joint statement by Prime Ministers Albanese and Manele that Australia would continue to be the Solomon Islands security partner of choice is a good example of Pacific-led, Australian-supported approaches to regional security. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the strategic environment we face demands a multifaceted approach. The Albanese government is drawing on all elements of national power, working to revitalise our Pacific relationships following a decade of neglect. We are working with the region to deliver on their priorities in a respectful way. We are delivering internet connectivity, including laying the first undersea cables that some of our partner countries have ever had. We're supporting aviation and air connectivity in the region. This support for digital and aviation capacity is critical to development and underpins economic growth. And we are working with partners across the Pacific to deliver migration options that expand our people-to-people links. The Rudd government established the first pilot for a Pacific seasonal worker scheme in 2008. This was the predecessor to today's Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Program. This PALM program has become a true success story in forging links with the Pacific, and we have now tens of thousands of Pacific women and men filling gaps in our labour market. They are earning remittances that support home communities and families. They are developing skills and experience which are helping them to set up their own businesses and employ others when they return home. I've met countless PALM workers across Australia and during my visits to the region. I've been impressed by their commitment, work ethic, and the contribution they are making to their Australian host communities and to their home countries. That's why the government has taken active policy decisions to expand the PALM. I'm also so excited about our new Pacific Engagement Visa. The Pacific Engagement Visa establishes for the first time in Australia's history a dedicated permanent migration pathway for the Pacific. And we're beginning with a quota of up to 3,000 visas per year. This will allow individuals and families to come to Australia on a permanent basis and establish lives here. They will be able to travel home as they need to maintain bonds with family and friends and take up all the opportunities that an Australian life can afford them. This new visa responds to long-held calls by the region, and the level of interest in it by the region has been incredibly strong. Registration for the first PEV ballot are closing this month. Tens of thousands of people from the 10 participating countries have registered for the ballot, significantly more than the cap of 3,000 places available. The next step for those selected in the ballot will be to lodge formal visa applications and for their applications to be assessed against the visa criteria. And we look forward to the first Pacific engagement visas being granted in coming months. This new visa will build the ballast of interpersonal links and a Pacific diaspora that will underpin our relationship with the region into the future. Professor Stephen Howes of the Australian National University has written that the Pacific engagement visa recognises the strategic importance of the region, of the Pacific, Australia's long-standing ties with the region, the underrepresentation of our near neighbours in our migration program, the support that remittances bring to the region, and righting the legacy of the historical wrongs of blackbirding and the White Australia policy. The waves of migration to Australia, particularly following World War II and with the formalisation of our multicultural policy, have made our country a richer, more unique place in the world. It's clear just how culturally literate and familiar we have become with different parts of the world, because migration has embedded these people and their cultures into the fabric of our Australian society. And so now, through the Albanese Government's efforts in the Pacific, and particularly through the Pacific Engagement Visa, I think we need to enter a new phase of our multiculturalism. Just as we collectively may feel familiar with family and friends from the UK, Italy, Greece, Lebanon or Vietnam and the Philippines, or China and India, I hope that the next phase of our migration and multicultural story will feature our Pacific friends more prominently. Estimates based on the last census put the number of people of Pacific Island heritage living in Australia at 337,000. That's 1.3% of our population. And this share will grow in coming years, reflecting demographic factors as well as measures like the Pacific Engagement Visa. Pacific are already embedded in our society and are making great but often under-acknowledged contributions to our communities. Some have been here for generations, the South Sea Islander descendants of the victims of blackbirding. We need to acknowledge and recognise their stories and their histories because they are part of our history. How can we grow our familiarity with Pacifica culture and traditions and foster a deeper Pacific connection here on our own shores? To truly meet the challenges of the age, in a region that is feeling it the most, we will need to change ourselves. We must improve our connections, knowledge and familiarity with the Pacific. We can learn so much from Pacific cultural values of family, collectivism, consensus, respect and spirituality. We have to keep renewing the multicultural commitment that we have served us so well for decades. We will need to keep evolving and iterating what we do to support the region around us and how we work with our neighbours. So in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, the Albanese Government's Pacific agenda runs as deep as it does broad, a multi-dimensional approach that aims to better integrate us with the region around us. But it's a region, I would argue, which we as a country have not traditionally understood all too well. The government's new policies have worked well over the past 2 years, but there remains so much more to do and so many opportunities to seize for Australia and for the Pacific. And for us, over time, I hope that Dorothy McKellar's imagery of our, and I quote, dual sea, will equally be at the heart of our national consciousness alongside the wide brown land. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Sounds great. Minister, thank you so much. We're all going to have a good chance to have a broad Q&A, so I encourage everyone to think about some questions. We'll have some roving mics coming out in a moment. Minister, thank you. That was a sweeping address, a broad overview of what all the specific policy measures that the government is doing. But what struck me is that you genuinely seem to have a passion and an interest and a real love in many ways for the region. I was wondering if you might be able to reflect a little bit on your own personal journey with your relationships with the Pacific, what you think people in Australia might not be aware of about the region, and a little bit of your own personal sort of reflections on the region.
Thanks for the question, Ed. And I think it's a requirement for this job that you've got to be an enthusiast. Like, you have to love what you're doing, because people, like any people, but particularly people in the Pacific, can smell fakes and phonies. They can just detect insincerity. People who are just going through the motions, reading off DFAT talking points on a card. Like, you've got to love it. And I follow in a fine tradition of Labor enthusiasts in this area. And there's others from the other side. Like, I think I disagree with Conchetta Fierravanti-Wells on almost everything in terms of politics. But she loved this job, and you could see it in the energy she took to it. And obviously, I'll tell this story. When I got appointed as the Shadow Minister for Defence, Industry and the Pacific, I rang Richard Marles to have a chat about how we divide our responsibilities. We talked for about 10 minutes on defence and about an hour on the Pacific, because he has the bug as well. So it started with me young. I grew up playing football. The lack of neck would give you an indication. And I was lucky to be surrounded by a lot of Polynesians. And my first grade coach was came from a Cook Islander family. I ended up playing in Sydney with a club that was proudly Tongan. So I'd play third grade, and they'd have the hungy in the ground, and the smell would be wafting over me. So I got a taste of that part of Pacific Islander culture, and I loved it. But I want to be very clear with this. While we talk about sports a lot, we should never simplify Pacific Island culture or our connections purely to sport. So when I started visiting the region, I was struck by the beauty of it, struck by the intense spirituality and the respect and devotion Pacific Islanders have for their environment and for their family. And if you spend any amount of time with them, you just can't help but love it. I think a couple of things I'd love Australians to learn: how close it is. When I ask people, what's our closest neighbour, people often say Indonesia. And that's not a bad answer. Like, Indonesia is critical to our future. But when I say you could literally swim to our closest neighbour, a Pacific country, if you weren't worried about crocodiles, and you should be, people, Sing Sing, 4 kilometres away, Papua New Guinea. And then the history in our country, the legacy there is just really important. The other thing I've got to tip, and there's people in this room who are much more expert than me, is you've got to learn about the Pacific Pause. And I was really lucky to be guided by the then New Zealand Minister for Pacific People, Bill Seo, and he taught me that no matter how long that pause is, you never fill it, and you show respect and you understand where you are, and so it's all about approaching these things with respect and humility.
So you reflected at the end of your remarks, about, and I mentioned this from the outset, the Pacific became sort of front of mind all of a sudden in the May 2022 election, with this increasing geostrategic competition. In many people's minds, the Pacific now is only really thought of in some ways in that way. People are maybe less familiar with the region. Obviously the government has followed through with a sweeping agenda, a real dedication to the various areas you've mentioned. How do you communicate to the Pacific that this isn't just a sort of cynical exercise, that it is very genuine, that the Australian government and people are really committed to this approach, rather than it being merely a response to a perceived threat from an adversary?
Well, I think you're absolutely right that there is scepticism out there, and that's why we always have to build on my side of politics, the credibility of the long engagement. Like Gough Whitlam saying, if he did nothing else in his political life than support independence in PNG, he would have died a happy man. Like, just shows that credibility. Like Hawke's involvement in opposing nuclear testing in the Pacific, helping support the Treaty of Rarotonga, what Paul Keating did, like, that is credibility that gives us runs on the board to say this is not about great power competition. That's a factor. There's no point denying it, but the Australian Labor Party has always seen the future of Australia entwined within the future of the Pacific. Our prosperity and our stability relies upon the prosperity and stability of the Pacific. You just can't think of it any other way. We are of the Pacific, and we need to recognise that. And climate change is critical to that. Like Prime Minister Albanese has used this term. Climate change is the entry ticket. It's the price you pay to even just start engaging with the Pacific. It's not sufficient in itself, but you can't get through the door unless you demonstrate that you're serious about taking action on climate change.
I'll throw to the audience in a moment, but one specific policy question. You talked about the seasonal worker program, the success, the expansion of that. I think there's huge benefits for that for so many people in the Pacific. As I mentioned at the outset, the McKell Institute primarily works on domestic policy issues. One of the constant issues we're hearing about is, labour shortages in not just the regions, but in aged care and these growth sectors. Is there sort of an appetite or interest from either the Pacific or the government to think about ways that something like the seasonal worker program could be extended beyond just, primarily regional work into some of these other critical frontline service industries over time?
Well, we are thinking about it, and we are expanding it, and we have expanded it. So we've got the sort of traditional seasonal worker stream, which is concentrated on things like agricultural fruit picking. There's the 4-year long-term visa for things. It's dominated at the moment by meatworks, but importantly, one of our election commitments that I announced was an aged care trial. So we've got 500 aged care workers from the Pacific working in aged care homes right now. And importantly, and this is where there's challenges, because this scheme is not without its challenges. We have to ensure that it complements what the Pacific wants to do. It can't be driving brain drain. And so, for example, Prime Minister Albanese and I in 2022 visited the Australia Pacific Training Centre in Fiji that is training aged care workers. And the facilities there are better than any training facility in Australia for aged care workers. And our goal is there, and is not to pull nurses out of the Pacific, and we do recognise that some instances that has occurred, is to train school leavers. They get a Certificate 3 in aged care, so they get exactly the same qualification as Australians, and they spend up to 4 years working in aged care residents, aged care homes, and then they go back with skills and huge remittance flows for their families. Importantly, we've changed the rules so that palm workers not just required to be paid the legal minimums, they have to be paid the market rates of pay. So, for example, in the aged care homes, if there's an enterprise agreement, they get paid exactly the same as an Australian. And there's good labour market testing. We can do more, and there are sadly instances of abuse and exploitation that we're always trying to crack down upon. But I'm firmly that this scheme is lifting not just individuals, but communities out of poverty. Latest stats show that on average, a long-term palm worker sends home 18,000 Australian dollars a year. That's in a region where half of all people live on $1,000 a year, which is the UN definition of absolute poverty. So it is massive. Yes, we have to deal with the brain drain challenges and issues around social dislocation if there's too many people coming from one community. But overall, I think it's a huge economic benefit for the region.
Happy to throw to the audience. Up the front, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Minister. Jess Collins from the McKell Institute. I just wanted to bounce off that conversation that you're just having now. You've mentioned a few times the economic benefits of the Pacific Labour Scheme and remittances and sending money home. We have heard a lot in the media lately about the decline in banking relationships, and remittance costs to the Pacific are still really high. I wondered if you have been exploring policy options to, address the banking issues and the cost of remittances. Thank you.
The short answer is yes to both those questions. We're working closely with Australian banks, both to retain and expand their presence in the Pacific. And I think Westpac made a decision last year to stay in the Pacific, and I'm grateful. And obviously ANZ have a really extensive network there. So it's really important that they stay and have a presence and provide those services. Loss of correspondent banking is a really significant challenge in the Pacific as well. And we had the US Pacific Australia Banking Forum in Brisbane last month that was really successful. And the remittance costs is a huge issue. I remember driving in Honiara past a Western credit union office, and the line out the door was appallingly long. And I was talking to ANZ, and they said during COVID they'd opened a very low fee remittance system, but they were struggling to get the sort of buy-in around how to run the system. So we're really committed to that because they should keep every single dollar they earn, or as close to it as possible. And I don't want it seen being eaten up by fees because it diminishes the power of the scheme.
Yeah, Brady.
Bridie Rice from the Development Intelligence Lab. Minister, congratulations on your appointment to Cabinet, but so too on the appointment of senior development expertise into your office as well. As an observer of your leadership over the last couple of years, it feels as though you've really been putting some strong foundations in place. So your speech referenced the relationships being generated in the Pacific, but there's also a lot of less visible work that is going on underneath the surface, thinking things like a new humanitarian strategy, development partnership plans, you name it. I wonder, presuming you are returned to a second term in office, what will characterise and focus your attention in the coming years ahead when it comes to both the development and the Pacific?
Well, that's a big question with a few assumptions there. First, I'm obligated to say we take nothing for granted. The next election's going to be very tight, and we'll see what happens. But I would hope whoever's in my role, and I hope it's me, focus on implementation. I think we've laid the groundwork through the Pacific policies, through the development policies, and we've got to get on with implementing it effectively. And one of the most important ways is those development partnerships and investing in quality infrastructure in the region that's focused on being climate resilient, that's focused on skills transfers so that Pacific workers can build the infrastructure and maintain it. Importantly, maintenance is critical, and it responds to the priorities of the region. One of the things I've been trying to push through, and I joke about it getting tattooed on the arm of every DFAT official, is the double dividend, which is when we do development in the Pacific, for me, it's a win if not a single dollar flows back to Australia, that every single dollar is spent in the Pacific, and they use local use local contractors, use local businesses as much as possible, so they get the double dividend of the infrastructure and the actual economic activity, and there's proper skills transfers. So driving that cultural change is really important. Obviously, a key part of our development policy is implementing 80% targets, so that 80% of our programs have a gender objective and 80% have a climate objective. And I want to see that followed through, and that can be transformational as well in helping support the struggle for gender equality in the region.
We'll go at the back, and then we'll go over the other side of the room in a moment.
Thank you very much, Minister. Just a few more words about your thoughts on the role of higher education institutions and your thoughts about welcoming more students coming over, as well as facilitating joint research, knowledge building. You ended your speech with, we want more knowledge building and sort of, extra remarks on that front. I'm from UNSW Function.
Oh, excellent. It's an essential part of our people-to-people links, and I was in Fiji recently where I announced the doubling of the number of Australia awards, and it's something that I've discovered in my journeys is the number of Australia Awards alumni who are in the Pacific making a huge contribution, and we want to see that grow. Training at Australian universities as well as Pacific universities is critical. A lesson I learned early on in this process is the power of regional institutions. In the Pacific, with the limited exception of a couple of large countries just lack the scale to replicate every institution you would expect in an advanced economy. So those crops, those regional organisations, whether it's the University of South Pacific, SPC, SPREP, have such a strong role in the region. So supporting them is incredibly critical. Resolving issues around USP was vital, and I want to see USP grow and provide ongoing value to the whole region. So education is a real strong thought, and liaison. So I want to see Australian universities cooperating with Pacific universities and Pacific institutions. My local university in Newcastle is doing a lot with SPREP on environmental remediation, particularly around escaping oil from World War II wrecks, and I would like to see more of those projects happening.
Yeah, over here on the left side.
Thank you. My name is Lai Ha Qian from UTS. Thank you, Minister. My question is basically related to the deep sea mining, if you don't mind, but that linked directly with the South Pacific in your portfolio as well. So currently, we know that the International Seabed Authority just elected the Secretary General, the incoming one, and deep sea mining activity is basically very controversial right now. And related to South Pacific, and I know that some country they are against it, some country they support it, and so there are a few countries right now, in this particularly in South Pacific or overall in the world, there are basically more than 32 countries calling for a moratorium of the deep sea mining. And Australia, I'm just wondering, from your government's position, what is Australia's position about this call for moratorium of deep sea mining, and how will that Australian position have impact on the South Pacific the relations? Particularly, you talk about this geopolitics in the region and the importance of the region in our security as well. And we know that, like for example, Nauru is one of the countries really calling for advocating for deep sea mining, and I think Nauru is going to do that quite soon. And Nauru is recently, at the beginning of this year, we connect with the China, the PRC, and how that kind of the relationship or China's influence, and particularly on the deep sea mining activities, and impacting on this geopolitics and security of Australia, and particularly Australians' position on the call for moratorium. Thank you.
Thanks for that question. I'll need to be slightly careful because policy responsibility for our position on deep sea mining is held by Minister Plibersek as the Environment Minister and Madeleine King as the Resources Minister, and they've made public statements on our approach that I refer you to. In terms of our international engagement in the Pacific, and this came up at last year's PIF at the Cook Islands, where I think the Cook Islands are open to exploring it as well, we'll be driven by the consensus of the PIF. This is an area, like all areas, but this is an area where we'll be driven and let the Pacific lead, and we'll follow in terms of our approach to the Pacific and the PIF. And the leaders' communique last year talked about requesting that the Secretariat produce some analysis and some guidance on how Pacific Island countries can approach it. And this is an area where we'll respond to their consensus views and come back to them. It's very important they have ownership of this issue rather than Australia seeks to impose a solution from our position.
Matthew. Oh, so do you want to go? Yeah, at the back. Yeah,
Nisambula Vanaka and G'day, Professor. My name is Chochiro Vulo, Professor and Chair of Social Work and Policy Studies at the University of Sydney and Adjunct Professor at the University of the South Pacific. I've got two related quick questions that are from a bigger picture perspective on the privileging of Pacific Indigenous ways of knowing and doing, being and becoming. I got back last night from Fiji, where I attended a meeting yesterday with UNICEF and DFAT on how do we continue to develop the workforce associated with child protection and family strengthening across the whole region. One of the challenges is this ongoing privileging of Western knowledges in dealing with social and welfare needs. So that's in the region, let alone here in Australia with the diaspora. We constantly see challenges with Pacific overrepresentation in the legal system, in health needs. A lot of it's to do with, again, Western perspectives on health and education, on the law, on legal engagements, with welfare needs. Loving everything that the government is doing, especially with the visas and the ability for us to come into the country and form a diaspora. But how do we meaningfully ensure that in Pacific Indigenous, again, ways of knowing and doing, being and becoming are meaningfully included in international development in the region and also within our social systems and structures here in Australia to ensure that there is levels of social cohesion and inclusion? Thank you.
Thanks. It's a great question, and one part of our policy that I didn't go into a lot of detail in my speech is the inclusion of a First Nations approach. We've appointed a First Nations ambassador who has travelled in the Pacific, and he'll get more involved, and we really want to lean on the wisdom of the First Nations wisdom of Australia, linking into the Indigenous knowledge in the Pacific. And we're trying to include that in all that we do. The development policy highlighted this as a critical path forward. As with everything, implementation will be where the rubber meets the road. And part of it is also about a genuine commitment to listening to local priorities. Like, that includes Indigenous voices. So I think that's going to be critical to how we embed it into our development approach to the Pacific. On social cohesion and diaspora back here, it's a challenge that we have to work through. I live and breathe it in my particular region, which has got significant diaspora. Part of it is cultural. Part of it's also economic. We should be very frank about overrepresentation of Pacific diaspora in lower SES levels. And people like Jim Chalmers are very focused on it, given he represents the mighty Logan area that has got a huge Pacific diaspora. So I don't have a solution for you, but we're open ears on how we engage more effectively, because what we're doing now is not sufficient.
Hi, Minister. Matthew from the Sydney Morning Herald. A question combining your two portfolios. The government recently made the significant announcement about foreigners serving in the Australian Defence Force, and in the first instance that's limited to the Five Eyes nations. That came as a bit of a surprise to some people, because there's been a big discussion about Pacific Islanders serving in the Defence Force, and some leaders are quite enthusiastic about it, like James Marape. Could you say a little bit about why in the first instance and not the Pacific? Are there any complications there? And if so, when could you expect Pacific Islanders to be serving, and how significant could the numbers be in the ADF?
Thanks, Matthew, for that excellent question that not only treads on my portfolio, treads on the DPM's portfolio and Matthew Keogh. So I want to be respectful, but both the DPM and I have been very open that we want to see Pacific recruitment into the ADF. We want to see that, and we're working on it right now. Why we chose the Five Eyes first was a couple of factors. One, the Five Eyes engagement is with permanent residents who've lived here for at least a year. So that's concentrating on onshore recruitment of non-Australian citizens, and that immediately opened up 800,000 New Zealanders to the recruitment pool. So that was the most efficient and effective way of opening up the recruitment pathway. And obviously there was a level of security checks that we're familiar with. What we're thinking about with the Pacific, and again, this is not a formal policy position, but where we're trying to engage is recruitment from the Pacific, not of Pacific Islanders living in Australia. So that's different, that's more complicated. You need to deal with the education systems and making sure that the applicants have the level of skills and education that's needed. You also got to make sure that we're not just pulling people out of existing defence forces, the Fijian Defence Force, the Papua New Guinean Defence Force, for example, or the Tongan Defence Force. So we're working through those options. But you're absolutely right, there's a level of enthusiasm in the Pacific for this, and I'm really excited about the opportunities. The Pacific has a strong, proud record of involvement in defence forces around the world. Obviously, you've got Fijians and Solomon Islanders serving in the UK military right now. You've got Micronesians from the compact states completely overrepresented in the US military in terms of as a percentage of the total population. So there are exciting opportunities, and what I'm most excited about is it's something, if we do it right, that provides a win-win for the region as well as Australia, because our greatest recruitment challenges aren't in infantrymen and women. We've got a lot of people who are happy to join the infantry. It's in the skilled trades where we face significant skill shortages. So if we get this right, we can be in a position where we recruit school leavers from countries like Papua New Guinea. We give them a trade in fitting and turning or a diesel mechanic. They serve in Australia, and they're able to return home with a trade that can open a business and obviously an Australian pension of some sort. So we're really excited about it. It's not our policy position yet, but we've been very open that we're working on it, and it will be one of the many ways that we're focused on solving the ADF recruitment challenges and bringing our region together. Like Prime Minister Marape is incredibly enthusiastic about it. Prime Minister Rambuka is also very open to it as well. He served with the Gurkhas in Hong Kong in his military service, so he understands the power of these sorts of approaches.
I think we just have time for one or two more. We'll go up to the front here if we're able to.
Thank you for your knowledge and your clear passion for the region. Two quick points from me that may be of assistance to you as you continue your good work through the region. One, you talk about the Blue Pacific and the connection there, not only in a cultural sense, but also in that economic sense. And we call it the Blue Highway that connects all of us. It's already there, but we're all affected by the international shipping lines' decisions that they will make around decarbonisations and clean fuels for the future. Having just come back from the Pacific Maritime Conference, can I suggest to you to also, whilst talking about aviation, also include into the mix the need for Australia to become part of the debate and go together with Oceania to the IMO, and we take our weaker nations from the region that don't have the loudest voice, but we take them with us in that debate to ensure that Oceania has a voice around future fuel types for the region. If they become so unattainable and so expensive, they will have a deleterious economic impact on many of these small nations. So Australia, big landmass, big voice, we have to take our neighbours with us on that. The other area I think there's an opportunity for Australia to do more is in that short-term skills exchange. Many of the Pacific nations have highly skilled workers, technical workers, in the port sector, for example. If we could work with government to bring them here, to teach them, for us to learn from them, to have that exchange of knowledge in terms of dealing not only with climatic change issues, but a whole host of issues, worker safety issues, I think we'll be the better for it. We have a home ground advantage. We all share this backyard, as you quite rightly point out. What we've got to do is work out measures that we can take advantage of common language, common understandings in relation to workplace safety, those sort of areas, and see where we can build that relationship beyond government, but actually involve industry.
Thanks, Mike. I'll treat those as suggestions rather than anything requiring a response, but thank you for those. They're really pertinent.
We'll have some time to have a broader chat after, but I think we just got time for one more specific question. We'll go over here to Jason at the end if we can.
Thanks very much, Minister. Jason Collins from the Europe Australia Business Council, and as you know, Europeans as well as other international partners are really important as part of that engagement in the region. In that respect, I wanted to ask about Australia's ambitions to host with Pacific partners the upcoming COP meeting, just how that has been received by leaders in the region and how the campaign is going. And secondly, if I could, I'm involved with a small Australian charity. We've been providing funding support for community-based projects in the region for medical care, development, education, etc. And through that, I've been struck by how very little or very small amounts of money can have transformational effects in local communities. And so has there been thought about how to kind of activate civil society in Australia to be more directly engaged, you know, twinning of schools or things like that that might actually create that greater awareness, but also, you know, more support into the region by Australian society?
Yeah, there absolutely is a lot of thought there, and I think we need to be a bit more systematic, but you're absolutely right. It has huge potential, and for example, I've intervened. There's a great program run by Rotary called ROMAC, where they fly over people for life-changing surgery that isn't available in the Pacific. I wrote to all the New South Wales health, all the state health ministers, because the patients were being charged as basically international rates. We got that changed to the Medicare rate, and that made a huge difference. But those community-led small-level interventions are really powerful. I've been supporting a great foundation in my area called Sione's Foundation, run by a former Tongan international rugby league player, and he raises funds, he raises goods, and they send over teams of skilled tradespeople to build water treatment plants. He just rebuilt the premier disability home in Tonga, run by his sister. They're building schools, and not only are we supporting them, to give you an example of where my two portfolios cross over, DFAT paid for the containers to ship them over, and I had an Australian defence vessel, the Reliant, ship over the containers on a trip to Tonga. So there's opportunities for us to involve the civil society much more effectively, and it's an area where people are incredibly generous. We've just got to find a constructive way of doing that, where it's not just shipping old equipment over, as important as that is. On COP, there's a lot of enthusiasm in the Pacific and a strong support for Australia. It was part of the PIF leaders' communique last year, support for it, and they see it as not just, there's multiple opportunities for them. One, obviously, is it gives them stronger lobbying power on Western nations, particularly Australia, on that. But this will be a genuine Pacific COP. There will be Pacific activities, it'll be centred on the Pacific as well as Australia, and it would shine a much greater light on the plight of the Pacific around climate change. I've attended a couple of COPs, and they're important, but I do feel like Pacific voices are consistently underheard in those fora, and anything we can do to support stronger Pacific voices, even when they're saying to Australia, we want you to do more, is a good thing, and that's why a Pacific COP co-hosted by Australia would be really important.
Well, on that note, I think, Minister, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a really broad discussion. There's some lunch over in the corner that will be served in a moment, so I encourage everyone to stick around. But can I just also thank Lend-Lease for hosting us here today? We're incredibly grateful for the partnership with Lend-Lease and for their hospitality. Minister, thank you. It's been a riveting conversation. We're looking forward to working with you further on many of these issues. Ladies and gentlemen, can you please put your hands together for Minister Pat Conroy?